Okay, I want to talk about a report on CNN about one of the largest, um, or one of, let's say, the most uh, high level, largest exposes, for want of a better term, of the illegal ivory trade in modern history. I'm going to get into that in a minute, but very briefly, I'll try and keep this restricted, but just to mention it, tonight is Oscars night in Los Angeles, and I've just seen the little red bulletin coming up on the CNN website. Green Book has won the Oscar for Best Picture. I think it stars Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali, and it's about an Italian American escorting a black man to the deep south. It looks quite good. I was going to see it. I wanted to see it, but part of me also thinks, well, has it just won because it's yet another race-related film? And there has been a trend in recent years. I mean, there's been a long string of films I can think of in the last few years that are about race relations. There is The Butler, there's Selma, there's 12 Years a Slave, there is the one about the African American women in NASA. There just seems to be a lot of films based on racial issues, um, and that's only scratching the surface that are doing well. Now, to be fair, I've seen a lot of those films, and most of them are pretty good in their own right. But you can't help but feel is that the reason that it's won. Keeping in the theme of films, I've been watching this Cleopatra, classic film. Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Rex Harrison, of course. It was a massive set. It was one of those, you can't call it a biblical film, but I guess Sword and Sandals, very popular in the 50s and 60s, famous for its massive sets. Interestingly, at the time, it had mixed reviews. I didn't realize that. And Elizabeth Taylor herself was quite critical of it, quite scathing. But it's one of those films that's done well over time. HMV has had a string of classic films, and they've sold them in this sort of format where they have the year 1963 and the main star. I like the format, and I like the sort of like the old cinema banner style. It's pretty cool. It's a very long film. I'm still watching it. It's about 4 hours long. Okay, so to get into this story, I'm just going to read out the first few paragraphs and comment about China in Africa. Let me put it that way. Among other issues. A Chinese woman nicknamed the Queen of Ivory and thought to be one of Africa's most notorious traffickers has been sentenced to 15 years in prison, Tanzanian authorities told CNN. On Tuesday, a Tanzanian court found Yang Feng Glan, that's an unusual Chinese name, I don't know if that's Jian or Glan, 70, another source says she's 69, but that's not really here or there, guilty of smuggling 860 elephant tusks that authorities say are worth $6.45 million. Yang Feng Jan Glam was sentenced along with her Tanzanian co-accused Sylvius Francis Matembo and Manasseh Julius Philemon. They were also sentenced to an additional 2 years in prison under Tanzania's Wildlife Protection Act, which they can convert into a fine amounting to twice the value of the ivory they are charged with smuggling. Authorities put this value at $12.9 million. The defendants have already logged an appeal, the court said. Tanzania's Director of Public Prosecutions accused Yang of running a sophisticated supply chain between East Africa and China using her ties to the Chinese and Tanzanian elite to move ivory across the world. And the report continues, scrolling down here. Yang was arrested in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania's largest city, on September the 28th, 2015, after a year-long manhunt. After more than 3 years of uncertainty and delays in the case, conservation organisations say the sentence sends a strong message to traffickers. The government has taken wildlife trafficking very seriously, said Chrissy Clark, the executive director of PAMS Foundation, a non-profit group that fights crime against wildlife and supports the Tanzanian task force that arrested Yang. Today's sentencing is testament that nobody in Tanzania is above the law. I'm not going to read out the whole article, but it just says that she has long-standing ties in Tanzania. She came there in 1975. She learned Swahili. She worked as a translator. and she was part of a Chinese company that was building a railroad linking the port of Dar es Salaam to Zambia. She was one of the first Chinese people to learn fluent Swahili. Okay, I will say this. In recent years, the Chinese government, and this is one of the very rare occasions I'll give them some credit, they have moved to crack down on illegal ivory coming into China, usually via Hong Kong. China has a massive market, the world's largest market. In fact, it's well known that ivory is used in traditional Chinese medicine. It's supposed to be for impotence and other things. It's an evil trade, a filthy trade, and it's directly leading to endangering these magnificent animals. But the Chinese government has made moves to crack down on this, and I think I gave a lesson to my students about this. I mean, it also comes down to the consumer. You know, when people buy ivory, they're fueling this filthy trade. Um, and I know there's been efforts to try and deter it. For example, dyeing ivory on living animals, which isn't very nice to see, but it makes it worthless as a commodity. I mean, this is a very real struggle, and people have been killed in the fight against illegal poaching. So it really is a very profound struggle. Um, and like I say, China is the biggest market. I do hope that it does send a deterrent. I hope other traffickers think twice about doing this. It would be wrong to say it's only the Chinese, but China is the biggest market. That's a fact. Um, some of the Chinese networks in recent years have used celebrities like Jackie Chan to speak out against this sort of industry, and that's a good thing. You know, if it can deter people, if the demand decreases, that's definitely a good thing. But I want to speak a little bit about wider issues here, and this will be controversial. But she was clearly using her position of influence as a Chinese businesswoman in Africa to, you know, do this for a long time, ostensibly getting away with it for a long time. Now, China has been very much pitching itself as the alternative to Western influence in Africa, and the West always has this baggage, particularly Europe, because of the colonial past. So Europe has to tread carefully in African affairs because Britain and France, in particular, are seen as the old colonial powers, and that's still a very sensitive subject. Even though I would point out that some of the worst atrocities in African history have occurred post independence, like the Rwandan genocide. But it's understandable. I mean, we done things that are unforgivable in Africa. You know, I wouldn't downplay that. However, the Chinese have kind of arrogantly presented themselves as, oh, well, we're not imperialistic. And yet, if you look at what's happening in recent years, if you look at the sort of, it's basically echoing what the British East India Company done in South Asia from the 1750s onwards. I mean, we're in no position to lecture the Chinese because we've done it, but at the same time, the Chinese are in no position to talk about being different from the West when what we're basically seeing in Africa right now is a sort of Chinese imperialism. And there's been examples of a sort of supremacist attitude. A few years ago, I believe it was in Nigeria, there were Chinese contractors filmed teaching an African man words in Chinese, but they were teaching him some very derogatory things to insult himself, and this was videoed. And there's been other examples of that. Now, before people misunderstand me, I'm not shit stirring here. I'm not saying that every Chinese person in Africa is a bad person. Not at all. Um, but, you know, China just shouldn't pretend it's doing something it's not. This is a sort of Chinese imperialism. And with communist ideology, they love to say they're against imperialism, but really what we're seeing in Africa is China's attempt to get its influence in every aspect of African life under the guise of huge scale construction projects. and they'll market it as a sort of mutual relationship between China and whichever country they're working with, and more often than not, those governments they will look to they will look east because whether it's because they don't want to be seen to be working with old colonial powers or not, I don't know, but I think there's things going on that kind of shine a spotlight on what China's agenda might really be. China is very may well surpass the United States this century as the world's most powerful country, and it will be a superpower. It's not quite at that level yet, not quite on par with the United States, but it is definitely heading that way, even with the economic slowdown. But I don't know. I just think that the next time Shenhua or CGTN talks about Western colonialism, we need to look at what China's real agenda is in Africa. Is it really about helping African nations move forward? Maybe it is, but China certainly doesn't care about multi-party democracy. It certainly doesn't care about human rights, and that may well be why certain African autocrats look to China because they know that China's not going to scrutinize that. China couldn't care less about human rights abuses or being multi-party republics, democracies. um, because obviously they're not. So that may well be why certain African governments are looking to China, whereas obviously when Western powers trade with anywhere, I mean, we cut our ties with Zimbabwe when Mugabe's excesses became very obvious. Not that the West has a perfect track record in this, far from it. I mean, we're way too close to Saudi Arabia, and that's got one of the worst human rights records on earth. So we can't say that we're always consistent on this, and that's a legitimate criticism of the West. It is, um, and it turns my stomach, frankly, how close we are to the Saudis. But this is about the ivory trade, but it's also about, well, here we have a prominent Chinese woman, and the Chinese aren't going to protest because they know. It's funny though, isn't it? Because if a Chinese was arrested, as we've seen in Canada, they kick up a hailstorm. But because they've been arrested in Africa, it's all politics. I mean, they want investment in Tanzania, so they're not going to protest on her behalf. They're just going to, leave her to it. Not that I have any sympathy, because it's an evil trade that she was involved in. But if it was in another country, if this was a Chinese national arrested in Britain or Canada or France, the Chinese would be kicking up a firestorm. So you can see what's happening here. Interesting.